Ludwig Wittgenstein was an Austrian philosopher from the 20th century, born into one of Europe's wealthiest families. He is a truly towering figure, but also a very complex one. Wittgenstein was a compelling man in his ideas and his personality. He was intense, a self-described tortured soul, as the physicist Freeman Dyson once put it, and he didn't hesitate to make radical life choices for the sake of his work. He gave away his vast inheritance to focus on philosophy and lived a life of stark contrasts, working as a rural schoolteacher, a monastery gardener, and even an architect. In Wittgenstein's world, the most important relationship was with his own ideas and his mentors, like Bertrand Russell. Russell was completely captivated by him. He once remarked that Wittgenstein was the kind of man who would never have noticed bursting shells when he was thinking about logic. For Rudolf Carnap, another key thinker, Wittgenstein's approach was almost mystical, like that of a creative artist or prophet whose insights seemed divinely inspired. Wittgenstein was a revolutionary philosopher, a truly radical thinker, but also a philosopher who was at war with himself. His early work claimed that what can't be said clearly should be met with silence. Then, in a stunning reversal, his later work completely rejected those early ideas. This move from a rigid, logical view of language to one based on context and language games fueled more debate, cementing his legacy as a thinker who wasn't just challenging philosophy, but challenging himself. What Wittgenstein tells us is that, in the end, our language is a map of the world. We only use it to paint pictures of reality, to show what's going on. Now, we need to make one thing clear. For us, for most people, language just works. What I mean is, when you say a sentence like, "the book is on the table," you don't think to yourself, "I am constructing a logical picture of a state of affairs." You just say, "The book is on the table," period. You don't think you have a representation of the book, you just have the fact that the book is there. In other words, for us, reality is what we can say about the world. It's what we can describe. That's the only meaningful reality. This is why he said the world is everything that is the case, that the world is the totality of facts, not of things. We don't just perceive individual objects, we perceive how they relate to each other, and yet we know our language can form these pictures. How do we know this? We know because a proposition is a picture of reality. It's a model of a possible situation. The logical structure of our sentence mirrors the logical structure of the world. But does this mean we can use language to picture anything? Does it allow us to talk about the meaning of life or what is good and evil? No, because these things belong to a different order, an order that is beyond, or rather outside of, the world of facts. When philosophers get into trouble, it's when they try to use language to discuss things like ethics or metaphysics. They try to produce knowledge about a reality that cannot be pictured. What Wittgenstein tells us is that there is a limit, and this limit is the world of facts, while other domains, even if important, must be passed over in silence. For the later Wittgenstein, a word doesn't have some secret, essential meaning. It's a trick our traditional thinking plays on us to believe in fixed definitions. When we use a word, we're using it inside a specific context, for a specific purpose, and from that use it gets its meaning. The word's meaning is the means by which we navigate our social world. You might say, but doesn't the word chair just refer to a chair? For Wittgenstein, this idea is too simple. That's just one of many ways we can use words. The idea that words are just labels we slap onto things is a craving for a tidiness that doesn't exist. We do not accept that language is messy and practical, and to mask this reality, we create illusions, philosophical systems. The hunt for universal definitions is a philosophical artifice, and a dictionary is the strategy humans use to forget that when they use a word, they're engaging in a social practice. The quest for a single definition misses the point of how language actually works. Searching for the one true meaning of a word is like trying to pin down a butterfly. The whole process is about getting to a feeling of certainty, but it also tries to make you forget that the real meaning is in the lived context. That's why Wittgenstein has a problem with traditional philosophy's search for essences. When we define, we do everything to hide our real intentions and cover up the destination the word is leading to. A particular use in a particular situation. That's the real end goal. The hunt for an eternal, unchanging meaning is just decoration. The garland we place on our words to forget that we're driven by context and that language is just a tool. Wittgenstein has a famous line, "The meaning of a word is its use in the language." It's only when you stop looking for a hidden essence that you become aware of how a word actually works. This practicality, this raw and flexible force that shows itself through language in a social and fluid way, is what he calls a language game. So if the meaning of a word is just its use, doesn't that mean anything goes? If I decide to use the word chair to describe the sky, am I just playing my own game? Isn't Wittgenstein just opening the door to complete chaos where no one can understand each other? Well, not exactly. Remember what this idea is built on. It's building on his concept that meaning is use. He called this next step language games. Let me use an analogy to explain it. A game of chess. It has its own specific rules, which are completely different from the rules of a game of soccer. And we, as speakers of a language, are playing these different games all the time. So where does philosophical confusion come from? It comes from trying to apply the rules of one language game to a totally different one. It's like trying to score a goal while playing chess. For example, asking for the meaning of a word in a scientific paper is a different language game than asking for its meaning in a poem. Does that make sense? But why does this happen? Why are we so easily confused? In his philosophical investigations, Wittgenstein suggests that the barrenness of skepticism stems from this very issue. He argues that our grammar, which seems to demand certainty, pushes us to talk about things we can't have any real knowledge of. In other words, we know how to use the words, but we get tripped up when we ask why they work the way they do outside of their specific game. And to that why, Wittgenstein has an answer. Language is not one single monolithic system. It is a collection of practices tied to what we do, like giving orders, telling jokes, or praying. Each is governed by its own logic within the context of our culture. So, if your feelings are completely your own, if your sensation of pain is something no one else can ever truly access, then what can you really say about it? Doesn't this create a kind of language that only you can understand? A world that is totally private? Well, not exactly. This is where one of Wittgenstein's most profound contributions, the private language argument, comes in. For a word to mean anything, it has to be shareable. The whole point of language is that it's public, with external ways to agree on what things mean. So if we were able to have a truly private language, it would break the very rules of what makes language work. Does that make sense? So what happens when someone tries? Wittgenstein, in his work Philosophical Investigations, gives an example. Imagine a person decides to keep a diary to record a private sensation, labeling it S every time it happens. Now, if we ask the question, what does S mean? Well, that's where things get more complicated. You might be tempted to say, it means that feeling. What more is there to say? But how do you know you're using S for the same feeling every time? You have no public standard, no external criteria to check. And to that problem, Wittgenstein has an answer. It can't be done. The symbol S is meaningless. This argument really undermines the whole idea of Cartesian dualism and its private inner world. It suggests that even our most personal experiences are given shape and meaning by the social and linguistic frameworks we all share. Wittgenstein tells us you can't separate a language from the world it's spoken in. We only know its meaning through the cultural and social practices that surround it. For most ordinary people, a word has a meaning. When you hear a word, you don't say to yourself, this word only makes sense within a specific community and its customs. You just say, I know what that means. If you hear someone talking about religion, you understand them. If you hear a scientist talking, you understand them. You don't think about the form of life that gives those words their power. For us, language is just the words we use. It's what we hear and say. That's the only reality. What one community allows us to understand, another might not. We don't use the language of science to have a religious debate, just as we don't use the language of faith to prove a scientific theory. And yet we know both kinds of language exist and have meaning, because we can see the communities, the ways of living, that allow us to understand what their words are for. But does this mean one language is logically superior to another? Can we prove that philosophical arguments are just about who is more rational? No, because the meaning belongs to a different order of reality, an order woven into our shared activities, our customs, and worldview. When philosophers argue, they aren't just making logical errors. They are often speaking from completely different forms of life. What Wittgenstein tells us is that to imagine a language means to imagine a form of life. Our world isn't built on pure logic, but on a world of shared human activity,